They didn't call him bold. They didn't call him innovative. They didn't even call him reckless. They called him crazy. In the ready room, the words circulated in low voices, half jokes, half warnings. A pilot who didn't respect doctrine was a liability. A pilot who questioned training manuals was a danger, and a pilot who openly said the manuals were wrong was someone you expected not to come back. So when his name appeared on the flight roster that morning, a few men exchanged looks, others shook their heads, and one officer quietly muttered that this would end badly. The irony was that none of them truly knew why he flew the way he did. They only knew the label that had stuck to him long before this mission ever began. Military aviation thrives on patterns. Procedures exist because they save lives, because they standardize chaos, because they turn fear into something manageable. This pilot understood that better than most. He had memorized every rule, every recommended maneuver, every warning printed in bold letters. But memorization is not the same as blind obedience. Over dozens of previous sorties, he had noticed something that others dismissed as coincidence. Pilots who followed the book perfectly were dying in predictable ways. The enemy wasn't improvising. The enemy was waiting for textbook behavior, exploiting it, feeding on it. That observation alone was enough to earn him a reputation. In war, questioning the system is tolerated only until it makes people uncomfortable. His instructors had flagged him early in training, not for lack of skill, but for attitude. He asked too many questions. Why do we always disengage here? Why do we never press the advantage there? Why does the enemy seem to anticipate us every time we do exactly what we were taught? The answers were always the same. Because that's doctrine. Because that's how it's always been done. Because deviation gets you killed. Over time, those answers stopped satisfying him. Not because he thought he was smarter than everyone else, but because the evidence in the sky contradicted the words on the ground. By the time he reached operational duty, the label had hardened, crazy, unpredictable, too aggressive, the kind of pilot commanders worried about because he might inspire others to do something stupid. What those commanders didn't see was that his so-called madness was rooted in pattern recognition. He flew enough missions to see repetition where others saw randomness. Enemy fighters approached the same way. Formations broke the same way. Panic spread the same way. War was chaos, yes, but it was also habit, and habits could be broken. The morning of the mission that would define everything felt no different at first. The same smell of fuel, the same metallic echo of boots on concrete, the same nervous jokes meant to disguise fear. Yet, beneath that routine, tension hung heavier than usual. Intelligence reports predicted heavy enemy presence. Losses were expected. The briefing officer emphasized discipline. Stick to formation. Follow doctrine. Do not improvise. The pilot listened in silence, nodding at the right moments, saying nothing that might draw attention. He had learned that arguing beforehand achieved nothing. If he was going to be judged, it would be in the air, not in the room. As he walked toward his aircraft, he felt the familiar isolation that comes when you know you see something others don't. It isn't confidence. It's responsibility. If Hri was wrong, the consequences would be immediate and final. There would be no chance to explain his reasoning afterward. No opportunity to say he had a theory. In the sky, results are the only argument that matters. That knowledge weighed on him far more than fear ever could. Other pilots avoided his eyes, some out of superstition, some because they didn't want to be associated with him if things went badly. A few quietly watched with curiosity. They had heard the rumors too that Khair flew closer than recommended, that he refused to disengage when the book said retreat, that he believed hesitation was more dangerous than aggression. None of them expected what was about to happen. Not the skeptics, not the doubters, not even the pilot himself, because even when you trust your instincts, you never truly know if they will save you or destroy you until the first shots are fired. And as the engines roared to life and the aircraft began to move, one question lingered unspoken in the minds of everyone watching. Was this finally the mission where the crazy pilot wouldn't come back, or the one that would force everyone else to rethink what they believed about air combat? If you're following this story and feeling the tension building, take a moment to engage with what you're seeing. Comment below with your thoughts. Did you expect a pilot labeled crazy to actually pull off something extraordinary? Every insight you share helps us understand how strategy, courage, and instinct collide in history's most critical moments. While you're at it, hit that like button if the suspense had your heart racing, and make sure you subscribe to the channel to follow more incredible untold stories from the skies of World War II. Your engagement ensures these forgotten feats don't vanish into the archives and keeps this community of history enthusiasts alive and thriving. There was a rule that never needed to be written down, because everyone absorbed it the moment they entered combat training. You do not break formation. You do not chase. You do not improvise once the fight begins. Air combat doctrine was built on the idea that survival depended on predictability, on every pilot acting as a small, controlled piece of a larger machine. The formation was sacred. The manual was law, and anyone who deviated from it was not just risking their own life, but the lives of everyone flying beside them. This rule existed for good reasons. Early in the war, pilots who chased enemy aircraft often flew straight into traps. Lone fighters were easy prey. Formations provided overlapping fields of fire, mutual protection, and a psychological sense of order in an environment designed to strip control away. Doctrine reduced fear by giving pilots something to cling to when instinct screamed to do the opposite. Follow the book, and you might live long enough to fly another mission. Break it, and you might not come back at all. But doctrine has a weakness. Fewer willing to admit. It assumes the enemy's reacting, not learning. Over time, the pilot began to notice something disturbing. Enemy fighters weren't just responding to formations, they were anticipating them. They knew exactly when Allied pilots would disengage. They knew the altitude where attacks would stop. They knew the angles pilots refused to cross because training manuals labeled them dangerous. What had once been a safety net had slowly become a cage. During previous missions, he watched skilled pilots die, not because they lacked ability, but because they hesitated at the exact moments doctrine demanded hesitation. They pulled away when the enemy expected it. They climbed when the enemy was already positioned above them. Every safe maneuver had become predictable. The enemy had turned Allied caution into a weapon. The unspoken rule said aggression was reckless, but the pilot had begun to suspect the opposite. That restraint, when it became habit, was far more lethal. He realized that air combat was no longer about who had the better aircraft or the tighter formation. It was about who disrupted expectations first. The side that forced the other to react instead of execute pre-planned moves gained an invisible advantage that no manual could quantify. Breaking that rule meant something terrifying. It meant acting alone, even while surrounded by others. It meant trusting personal judgment over collective behavior. And worst of all, it meant accepting that if it failed, there would be no defense. No explanation. The after-action report would simply say, pilot error, reckless maneuver, loss due to deviation from doctrine. History would move on without asking why. That was the cost of breaking the rule. Not just death, but blame. The pilot understood this fully. He wasn't driven by ego or a desire to prove others wrong. He was driven by a growing certainty that repeating the same behaviors was guaranteeing the same outcomes. And the outcomes were unacceptable. What made his decision even more dangerous was timing. He wasn't planning to break the rule gradually or test it under safe conditions. He would do it in the middle of a full-scale engagement surrounded by enemy aircraft, where reaction time was measured in seconds. One wrong calculation and the experiment would end instantly. Yet, in his mind, the risk had already been calculated. Doing nothing different meant dying eventually. Doing something different at least introduced the possibility of survival. The rule that everyone else followed unquestioningly had become, in his eyes, the most dangerous thing in the sky. And as the aircraft climbed toward enemy airspace, he made a quiet commitment. When the moment came, he would ignore the rule, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Because sometimes the line between madness and breakthrough is drawn by whoever survives long enough to explain it. What most pilots never realized was that the real killer wasn't enemy fire. It was delay. A fraction of a second that seemed insignificant in training became fatal in combat. The pilot had felt it dozens of times before he could explain it. That brief hesitation between seeing an opening and acting on it. The pause drilled into muscle memory by endless repetition of rules meant to keep pilots safe. In the air, the pause translated into lost angles, missed opportunities, and enemy guns finding their mark first. Combat reports rarely mentioned it. They spoke of superior enemy numbers, better positioning, unlucky timing. But when the pilot reviewed those reports mentally, mission after mission, a pattern emerged. Pilots weren't being outflown, they were being outweighted. Every maneuver had a prescribed moment. Every disengagement followed a predictable rhythm. The enemy learned that rhythm faster than command ever admitted. The most dangerous error was invisible because it felt responsible. Pilots were trained to confirm before committing, to wait for the perfect firing solution, to disengage rather than press when the situation felt uncertain. On paper, this reduced risk. In reality, it handed initiative to the enemy. The pilot noticed that enemy fighters thrived on hesitation. They exploited moments when Allied pilots chose safety over momentum. Those moments were enough. He remembered one engagement clearly. A friendly pilot had the enemy perfectly framed in his sights, but pulled away because the altitude margin wasn't ideal. Seconds later, that same enemy reversed, climbed aggressively, and shot the friendly pilot down. The mistake wasn't mechanical. It wasn't lack of skill. It was obedience to a rule that no longer applied to the reality unfolding in the sky. What made this error so lethal was that it felt like discipline. Pilots congratulated themselves for disengaging cleanly, even as they surrendered control of the fight. Over time, this created a psychological trap. The more pilots survived by avoiding risk, the more risk became terrifying, and the more terrifying risk became, the easier it was for the enemy to dominate the tempo of combat. the pilot began to understand something unsettling. Air combat had shifted from a contest of machines to a contest of nerve. The enemy wasn't just fighting aircraft. They were fighting expectations. They knew Allied pilots would not cross certain thresholds. They knew when pursuit would stop. They knew when aggression would soften into caution. And they planned every move around those limits. This realization isolated him further. He couldn't easily explain to others that their discipline was killing them. It sounded like arrogance, like bravado, like the mindset of someone who hadn't yet paid the price for and maybe that was why so many pilots dismissed him, because acknowledging the flaw meant questioning everything they'd been taught to trust. The invisible error wasn't cowardice. It was conditioning. Training designed for earlier phases of the war had not adapted fast enough to an enemy that learned relentlessly. The pilot saw this gap widening with every mission, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Every fight confirmed the same truth. The first side to act decisively, even imperfectly, gained control. The side that waited lost it. That was the moment the label of madness truly formed, because the pilot didn't just notice the error, he resolved to remove it completely. No hesitation, no waiting for permission from doctrine. When the opportunity appeared, he would act instantly, even if it meant violating every principle he'd been trained to respect. He understood the irony. By eliminating hesitation, he was embracing danger. But by embracing danger deliberately, he was also denying the enemy their greatest advantage. The question was no longer whether the mistake existed. The question was whether correcting it would save him or destroy him. And as enemy airspace drew closer, the pilot felt a strange clarity settle in. The invisible error had already claimed enough lives. He would not let it claim his without a fight. The decision did not come during the briefing, or while taxiing down the runway, or even during the long climb to altitude. It came seconds before contact, in that narrow window where training ends and instinct takes over. The pilot saw the enemy formation appear ahead, dark shapes cutting through the sky exactly where intelligence predicted they would be. Everything was unfolding by the book. And that was the problem. In those seconds, time stretched in a way only combat pilots understand. The roar of the engine faded into the background. The radio chatter became distant, almost irrelevant. What remained was a crystal clear awareness of position, speed, distance, and intent. He recognized the setup immediately. The enemy was positioning for a textbook engagement, one designed to exploit hesitation and punish any attempt to disengage too late. He had seen the pattern before, many times, usually followed by wreckage falling through clouds. This was the moment. Doctrine demanded patience. Maintain formation, wait for orders, engage only when conditions were optimal. The voice of training was calm, authoritative, familiar. But another voice was louder now, a voice shaped by observation rather than instruction. It told him that if he waited, the enemy would dictate the fight, that if he reacted instead of acted, the outcome was already decided. He checked his instruments one last time. Fuel within limits, engine steady, controlled surfaces responsive. No mechanical excuses. If this went wrong, it would be his fault alone. That realization carried a strange sense of freedom. There would be no blaming the machine, the weather, or the formation. The responsibility was total, and that made the choice simpler. In the space of a breath, he accepted something most pilots never consciously do. He accepted that survival was no longer guaranteed by obedience. obedience, that the safety promised by rules was conditional, fragile, and increasingly outdated. He accepted that what he was about to do might end his career or his life, and he accepted it without drama. The enemy began their approach, confident, measured, precise. They expected the familiar responses, minor adjustments, defensive positioning, predictable angles. Instead, the pilot felt his hands tighten on the controls. His body leaned forward slightly, as if closing the distance faster. Through sheer intent, he was no longer thinking about victory or survival. He was thinking about disruption. The decision was final before he could fully articulate it. He would not wait. He would not disengage. He would attack first, earlier than logic allowed, closer than doctrine recommended. He would force the enemy to abandon their plan and react to his. In that instant, he crossed an invisible line that separated trained pilots from something else entirely. What made the decision so dangerous was not the maneuver itself, but the timing. A second too early, and he would be isolated. A second too late, and the enemy would already have the advantage. There was no margin for hesitation now, because hesitation was the enemy. The pilot felt an intense focus settle in, sharper than fear, colder than adrenaline. This was not panic. This was commitment. Around him, other aircraft held formation, unaware that one pilot was about to shatter the rhythm of the engagement. Radios crackled with routine updates. No alarms, no warnings, just a steady march toward contact. And then, without announcing it, without asking permission, he moved. The aircraft surged forward, breaking the expected geometry of the fight. It was a subtle shift at first, but one with enormous consequences. The enemy formation hesitated, just slightly as they recalculated. That hesitation was everything. In that sliver of time, the pilot knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would define him forever. This was the moment the label of crazy stopped mattering, because from here on, the sky would decide who was right. By every metric that mattered, the first confrontation should have ended in disaster. The pilot had broken formation early, closed distance faster than recommended, and entered a zone where reaction time shrank to almost nothing. From the ground, from the manuals, from the safety of hindsight, it would later look reckless. But in the air, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The enemy formation faltered, not dramatically, not all at once, but just enough to fracture the rhythm they depended on. Enemy pilots are trained as rigidly as their opponents. They expect certain responses because those responses have kept them alive. When those expectations collapse, even briefly, confidence evaporates. The pilots saw it in the micro movements of the opposing aircraft. A delayed roll, a widened spacing, a subtle overcorrection. These were not mistakes born of fear. They were signs of recalculation. And recalculation in combat is vulnerability. As he pressed in, the pilot felt the engagement tilt. What moments earlier had been a controlled intercept now became a scramble for position. The enemy, forced to abandon their prepared angles, reacted instead of executed. That single shift reversed the psychological balance of the fight. For the first time, the pilot was not responding to threats. He was creating them. The initial exchange was violent and compressed. Tracers cut through the sky in intersecting arcs. The pilot ignored the urge to pull away after the first pass. Doctrine would have demanded it. Instead, he stayed in the fight, maintaining pressure, denying the enemy time to reset. One opposing aircraft broke sharply downward, abandoning its role entirely. Another hesitated long enough to drift out of optimal position. These were small gains, but they compounded rapidly. What made this moment so dangerous was that success could easily mask risk. Every second he remained engaged increased exposure. Fuel burned faster. Situational awareness narrowed. One unseen aircraft could end everything. The pilot knew this. He felt it. Yet he also recognized that retreating now would surrender the advantage he had just created. Momentum, once lost, rarely returned. The enemy attempted to regroup. They tried to pull him into a more familiar pattern, widening the fight, restoring spacing, waiting for him to make the expected defensive move. He didn't. Instead, he mirrored their adjustments, staying close enough to disrupt but far enough to maneuver. It was a balance he had never practiced formally, only envisioned mentally during long hours of reflection after previous missions. Then came the moment that confirmed his theory. An enemy pilot committed too early, assuming the aggressive approach would force a breakaway. The pilot didn't disengage. He tightened the turn, anticipated the reversal, and closed the gap at precisely the wrong moment for his opponent. The result was decisive. One clean engagement, resolved faster than anyone watching could fully process. That single outcome sent a shock through the fight. Enemy aircraft scattered, abandoning cohesion in favor of individual survival. What should have been a coordinated attack dissolved into fragmented, isolated encounters. This was never supposed to happen. Not against trained pilots, not against disciplined formations, and certainly not because of one aircraft acting alone. Inside the cockpit, the pilot registered none of the disbelief that would later follow. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't counting victories. He was adapting continuously, moment by moment, aware that the same aggression that created opportunity could just as easily create exposure. The fight was far from over. If anything, it had only begun. But something irreversible had already occurred. The first confrontation, the one that should have punished defiance, had instead rewarded it. The sky had responded differently than the manuals predicted, and as the pilot scanned for the next threat, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer an experiment. It was a turning point unfolding in real time. What followed was not a reflex or a lucky reaction. It was a maneuver no one formally trained for because no one was supposed to attempt it. The pilot didn't invent it in that moment, but he was the first to trust it when everything was on the line. Instead of disengaging after the initial exchange, instead of resetting altitude and distance, he compressed the fight deliberately. He turned the sky into a smaller, faster battlefield, where speed of decision mattered more than perfect positioning. Traditional training emphasized separation. Create space. Reassess. Re-enter on your terms. The pilot did the opposite. He stayed close inside the enemy's decision loop, forcing constant micro-adjustments. Every second the enemy spent reacting was a second they weren't planning. That was the core of the maneuver. Not a specific angle or turn, but relentless pressure that denied the opponent's mental breathing room. He anticipated where the enemy expected him to retreat and went there first, not to escape, but to intercept. This violated one of the most deeply ingrained assumptions of air combat, that proximity was dangerous, that distance was safety. In reality, distance gave the enemy time to coordinate, time to recover, discipline. By collapsing that distance, the pilot transformed the engagement into something far more chaotic and far less forgiving. The maneuver worked because it attacked expectation rather than machinery. Enemy pilots were conditioned to certain sequences: attack, force, disengagement, reposition, attack again. The pilot shattered that rhythm. He remained present, aggressive, unpredictable. Every time an enemy aircraft tried to extend or reposition, he cut the angle short, appearing where they did not expect him to be. This was not reckless pursuit. It was calculated intrusion. He never fixated on a single target for too long. Instead, he treated the engagement as a fluid system, constantly shifting focus to wherever disruption would be greatest. One aircraft hesitating to reform became more valuable than one already committed. Another drifting out of formation became an opportunity to fracture the entire group. What made the maneuver especially effective was how quickly it drained the enemy's confidence. Precision flying requires trust. Trust in timing. Trust in support. Trust that others will be where they're supposed to be. That trust evaporated as the pilot continued to press. Enemy aircraft began making defensive moves earlier than necessary, breaking formation without coordination. Small errors multiplied. Inside the cockpit, the pilot felt the engaging change texture. The fight no longer flowed smoothly. It lurched. Enemy movements became abrupt, reactive. He wasn't overpowering them, he was unsettling them. That distinction mattered. It meant the advantage could persist as long as pressure was maintained. The moment he backed off, order would return. He did not back off. This approach demanded extreme awareness. There was no room for tunnel vision. Staying close meant threats could appear from any direction with little warning. The pilot compensated by scanning constantly, never lingering emotionally on a single outcome. Success was temporary. Survival required continuous motion, continuous reassessment. As the maneuver unfolded, something remarkable happened. The enemy stopped attacking as a unit. They began fighting as individuals. That was the collapse point. Trained formations rely on mutual support. Once broken, each pilot must rely solely on personal skill and instinct against an opponent already operating on instinct. This was devastating. The pilot understood the risk. He knew this tactic could not be sustained indefinitely. Fuel, fatigue, and the simple probability of being surprised all worked against him. But for now, it was working. The sky had become unfamiliar to the enemy. Their advantage had dissolved into uncertainty. This was the moment when a single unconventional decision turned into a repeatable outcome, not because it was safe, but because it was effective. And as the engagement continued to unravel around him, one realization became unavoidable. He wasn't just surviving the fight. He was rewriting how it was being fought. The effect on the enemy was immediate and profound, not just tactically, but psychologically. Air combat is fought as much in the mind as it is in the sky. Pilots rely on confidence to make split-second decisions. Confidence comes from familiarity, from knowing what usually happens next. In this engagement, that certainty vanished. The enemy pilots were no longer executing a plan. They were reacting to surprises they could not predict. The first sign was hesitation. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle delay that creeps in when assumptions fail. Enemy aircraft that should have pressed their attack broke early. Others held back, waiting for support that never arrived. The pilot could see it clearly. Wide spacing where tight formations should have been. Defensive maneuvers initiated too soon, wasting energy and position. These were not mechanical failures. They were cracks in confidence. Fear behaves differently when it's unexpected. Trained pilots are prepared to face danger within a known framework. They know where threats come from, how long engagements last, and what their escape options look like. What unsettles even the most experienced fighter pilot is a threat that doesn't behave correctly. When the pilot refused to disengage, refused to reset, refused to give the enemy the breathing room they counted on, the enemy's mental map of the fight collapsed. Communication began to break down. Enemy aircraft started maneuvering independently, no longer synchronized. Calls for repositioning came too late. By the time a pilot realized they were exposed, the moment to correct it had already passed. This is where air combat becomes unforgiving. Confusion costs altitude, altitude costs speed, speed costs options. And once options disappear, survival becomes a matter of luck. The pilot sensed the shift before he could fully articulate it. Enemy movements became sharper, more desperate. Instead of calculated aggression, he saw defensive, flying aircraft turning away instead of toward opportunity. Pilots choosing separation over coordination. That was the psychological collapse point. Once fear replaced discipline, the engagement tilted permanently. What made this so devastating was that it spread. One pilot breaking early forced another to compensate. That compensation created new vulnerabilities. Each reaction rippled through the formation, amplifying instability. The pilot didn't need to destroy every aircraft to win the fight. He only needed to keep the enemy unsettled long enough for mistakes to multiply. Inside his cockpit, the pilot stayed focused on pressure, not pursuit. He understood that fear feeds on uncertainty. Every unexpected angle, every refusal to disengage, reinforced the enemy's growing doubt. He didn't chase recklessly. He appeared where he wasn't supposed to be. That alone was enough to keep the enemy guessing. This psychological edge was something no manual could teach. It wasn't about bravery or recklessness. It was about timing and presence. The pilot had inserted himself into the enemy's decision cycle and refused to leave. As long as he stayed there, the enemy could not regain control. By now, the engagement no longer resembled a coordinated battle. It looked like a series of disconnected reactions. Enemy pilots fought the moment instead of the fight. And in that state, even skilled aviators become vulnerable. As the sky filled with fragmented movement and broken patterns, one truth became clear. The enemy was no longer thinking about winning. They were thinking about surviving. And that shift, once it happens, is almost impossible to reverse. What unfolded next defied every expectation of how a single sortie was supposed to end. Air combat doctrine assumed one decisive exchange, followed by disengagement or withdrawal. Multiple confirmed victories in a single flight were rare, usually the result of overwhelming numerical advantage or sheer luck. This was neither. The pilot remained alone in hostile airspace, with fuel diminishing and time working against him. Yet the engagement kept opening new windows of opportunity instead of closing them. The key was continuity. By refusing to reset the fight, the pilot prevented the enemy from regaining structure. Each broken element attempted to reform, but reforming required time and predictability. Both were denied. An enemy aircraft would break away defensively only to expose another that assumed temporary safety. The pilot exploited these transitions, not with reckless pursuit, but with calculated positioning that forced repeated errors. Victory did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. One engagement resolved immediately, followed by another before the enemy could process what had happened. The sky became a sequence of short, violent decisions rather than a single, extended battle. Each resolution reinforced the same psychological pressure. The enemy was no longer facing a predictable opponent. They were facing a presence that refused to vanish. What made this sequence improbable was endurance. Maintaining such pressure demanded intense concentration. The pilot had to constantly reassess altitude, speed, and orientation while resisting the instinct to disengage after each success. Fatigue crept in silently. Vision narrowed. The temptation to retreat grew stronger with every passing second, but retreat would have restored order. And order was the enemy's ally. The third engagement was the most dangerous. Fuel margins were tighter. Situational awareness was harder to maintain. Yet the enemy made the same mistake again. Assuming the pilot would finally break off, they committed late, half-heartedly, trying to cover too much space with too little coordination. That hesitation was decisive. The pilot acted before the enemy fully committed, collapsing their options before they realized the trap had closed. By the fourth outcome, disbelief replaced fear. Enemy aircraft disengaged entirely, abandoning the area rather than risking another unpredictable encounter. This was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a psychological retreat. The fight had ceased to make sense to them. The rules they relied on no longer applied. And when combat stops making sense, survival instincts override strategy. Inside the cockpit, the pilot finally allowed himself to breathe. Not in relief, but in recalibration. He was acutely aware that pushing further would invite catastrophe. The sequence had reached its natural limit. Fuel levels dictated reality. Ammunition counts confirmed restraint was now necessary. The moment demanded discipline of a different kind, knowing when to stop. He disengaged not because doctrine demanded it, but because judgment did. That distinction mattered. The decision to leave the fight came from awareness rather than instruction, and that awareness marked the final confirmation of his theory. Aggression had opened the door. Control had kept it from slamming shut. As the aircraft turned toward home, the pilot replayed the engagement not as a series of victories, but as a chain of reactions. Each outcome flowed logically from the last once the initial pattern was broken. There was nothing mystical about it. No miracle. Just a refusal to surrender initiative and an understanding of how fragile order becomes under sustained pressure. By the time he crossed back into friendly airspace, the implications of what had happened were already larger than a single mission, for outcomes in one flight could not be dismissed as chance, not by those who understood the sky, and certainly not by those who would soon have to explain how a pilot labeled unstable had returned with results no one thought possible. The moment the aircraft touched down, nothing happened. No cheering, no rush of officers, no immediate congratulations. Just the familiar scream of tires on concrete and the engine winding down as if this had been any other routine return. That silence was heavier than applause could ever be. The pilot climbed out of the cockpit expecting questions, maybe reprimands, maybe disbelief spoken out loud. Instead, he was met with looks that said no one knew what to say yet. Ground crew members exchanged glances as they checked the aircraft. No visible damage, no obvious explanation written on the metal skin. The pilot removed his helmet slowly, fully aware that what he had done challenged more than expectations. It challenged authority. Results like these forced uncomfortable conversations. And uncomfortable conversations in wartime were often delayed. In the operations room, the air felt thick. Mission reports were coming in from other pilots, many of whom had seen fragments of the engagement from a distance. They struggled to describe it clearly. Some spoke of broken enemy formations. Others mentioned aggressive positioning that didn't align with doctrine. A few simply said the fight looked different around that one aircraft, different enough to unsettle everyone watching. When the pilot finally spoke, his voice was calm. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He described decisions, timing, reactions. No hero language, just cause and effect. That restraint made the room quieter. Officers accustomed to bold claims and defensive justifications found themselves without a clear angle of response. The numbers spoke loudly enough for confirmed outcomes. No losses. No deviations from physics, only from expectations. The most telling reaction came not from command, but from other pilots. Those who had dismissed him as reckless now listened carefully, not because they admired defiance, but because they recognized survival. Pilots respect what works. Reputation means nothing in the air. Results mean everything. And these results demanded attention. There was discomfort in the silence that followed. Doctrine exists to protect lives, but doctrine also resists change. A single successful sortie could be dismissed as luck. Two might raise eyebrows. For forced reconsideration, the pilot was not celebrated, but he was no longer ridiculed. The label that once followed him into every briefing room suddenly felt outdated. What made this moment so powerful was what didn't happen. No immediate rewrite of manuals. No public acknowledgement of error. Just a quiet shift in how conversations unfolded. Questions began appearing that hadn't been asked before. What if aggression wasn't the enemy? What if hesitation was? What if initiative mattered more than adherence in certain conditions? As the pilot left the room, he understood something crucial. Change in war rarely arrives with announcements. It arrives through outcomes that cannot be ignored. The silence he walked through wasn't emptiness. It was pressure building. Pressure that would soon demand release. Before the next mission, others would quietly experiment. Small adjustments, slightly different timing, subtle deviations that mirrored what they had witnessed, not because they were ordered to, but because they had seen possibility where they once saw danger. By the time the next briefing cycle began, something subtle but irreversible had shifted. No official statements were made, no doctrine was rewritten overnight. Yet the tone in the room was different. Pilots listened more closely when tactics were discussed. Instructors paused longer before dismissing unconventional questions. The story of that sortie traveled faster than any report passed pilot to pilot in fragments, each retelling sharpening the same uncomfortable truth. What everyone thought was impossible had already happened. What made this moment so dangerous for the system was that it exposed a crack in certainty. Military structures depend on predictability to function. When predictability fails, adaptation must follow, even if it arrives reluctantly. The pilot had not proven that doctrine was useless. He had proven it was incomplete. And incomplete systems are the most dangerous kind because they create the illusion of safety while quietly producing losses. In subsequent missions, no one openly announced they were copying his approach. That would have been too obvious, too confrontational. Instead, changes appeared indirectly. Engagements began slightly earlier. Disengagements happened slightly later. Pilots held pressure longer than before. Small deviations accumulated. Just as the pilot had predicted, the sky became less predictable, not for friendly aircraft, but for the enemy. Enemy pilots noticed the change as well. Reports began mentioning increased aggression, reduced hesitation, fighters that did not behave as expected. Tactics that had worked reliably for months started failing. Enemy formations became more cautious, more defensive, more prone to disengage early. This was not because Allied aircraft had suddenly become superior machines. It was because their pilots had begun reclaiming initiative. The transformation was not universal, nor was it instant. Some pilots clung to the old rules, and some paid for it. Others adapted faster, guided not by orders, but by observation. War has a way of selecting behaviors brutally. Those that work spread. Those that don't disappear. The pilot's flight became a reference point, not officially, but practically, a proof of concept written in fuel burn, altitude, loss, and enemy retreats. What history often misses is that revolutions in combat rarely begin with commanders. They begin with individuals willing to absorb risk when systems lag behind reality. This pilot was not reckless by nature. He was responsive. He saw what the sky demanded before the manuals did. And by acting on that understanding, he forced an entire structure to confront its own limitations. Long after the mission ended, the label that once followed him faded. Not because anyone apologized, but because labels lose power when outcomes contradict them. Crazy became inconvenient to say. Unstable became inaccurate. What remained was effectiveness. And effectiveness is the one quality war respects above all else. The most lasting impact of that day was not the number of victories recorded. It was the shift in mindset, the realization that initiative could outweigh obedience, that timing could matter more than perfection, that waiting for permission in a dynamic fight could be more dangerous than acting decisively. As future pilots trained under revised assumptions, few would know his name. Fewer still would understand how close the system came to ignoring the lesson entirely. But the sky remembered. Every engagement that unfolded with more aggression, more pressure, and less hesitation carried a trace of that single flight. And somewhere between doctrine and instinct, a new balance emerged, one forged not by theory, but by someone willing to challenge it in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. If you stayed with this story until the very end, you're someone who truly understands how history is shaped, not by comfort, but by decisions made under pressure. Take a moment now and subscribe to the channel, because every story we tell dives into moments just like this one, where a single action rewrites everything we thought we knew about war. Leave a like to show the algorithm that these untold military stories still matter and deserve to be seen. And most importantly, leave a comment below with the word initiative if you believe that one bold decision can change the course of history. That comment helps build a community of people who don't just watch history, but think about it deeply. Now, don't stop here. On your screen is another video that continues this journey into unexpected strategies, overlooked tactics, and moments that changed warfare forever. Click it and keep going.